The last air raid siren over Cologne died in a trembling note that sank into the misted roofs like an exhausted breath. For the first time in 6 years, mothers dared to open their shutters at night. Yet the silence was not peace, only a space where fear could change its face. Frau Martha Schneider pressed her son's head against her chest as boots echoed in the stairwell. They were not American boots yet. The men climbing the stairs wore the black leather of the Ordnungspolizei, the same who had searched her apartment every month, accusing her of hoarding flour, of listening to foreign radio, of failing to smile when Hitler spoke. When they left, she found her ration cards scattered on the floor. One officer had taken the last piece of soap. Outside, the city smoldered, bridges gone, water black with ash. Rumors spread that the Americans were at the Rhine. Some neighbors whispered they would be worse than devils. Others whispered they might be human. Both were guesses made in hunger. At dawn, a column of jeeps appeared through the smoke. Their engines hummed, not roared. Marta watched from behind a cracked window pane as a young soldier jumped down, dark skin glinting with sweat. He opened a crate, handed out tins of milk, and smiled at a child tugging his sleeve. Another soldier helped an old man carry a pail of water up the street. No slogans, no inspections, no shouting about loyalty, just quiet work. By midday, the same courtyard where policemen had beaten a neighbor was filled with steam from field stoves. The smell of real coffee drifted through alleys that had forgotten it. Marta's boy whispered, "Mama, they don't look like enemies." She wanted to hush him, but couldn't. Something in the rhythm of those movements, the calm handing of bread, the nods of respect to gray-haired women, felt like a foreign language she suddenly understood. That evening, as darkness returned, no siren cried. The city's silence turned gentle. In her small notebook, Marta wrote, "Peace doesn't sound like silence. It sounds like footsteps that do not kick doors." Across Germany, similar awakenings multiplied. In the Ruhr, in Dresden, in towns burned to skeletons, women saw the same pattern. The end of fear did not wear their own uniform. It arrived in khaki and dust, carrying milk instead of orders. By July 1945, U.S. Army civil affairs teams had distributed over 4.2 million food parcels to civilians, an operation larger than any humanitarian effort Europe had ever seen. It was not charity alone that changed hearts. It was the comparison. For 12 years, the same policemen had demanded obedience in the name of safety. Now, safety arrived without demands. The moral arithmetic was simple enough for a child to read. Those who once claimed to protect had hunted. Those called conquerors now rebuilt. As the night deepened, Marta tucked her son into bed. From the window, she saw an American soldier lighting a cigarette beneath a ruined street sign that once read Adolf Hitler Strasse. The flame flickered against the letters, then died. And in that tiny moment of darkness, she realized the war had ended not when the siren stopped, but when the fear of her own police finally did. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now in your part of the world. The winter of 1945 settled over Saxony like a punishment no one had earned. The fields lay frozen and gray, and the last train carrying food from Berlin had vanished somewhere near Leipzig. In the village of Lomach, mothers tore the lining from old coats to wrap their children's feet, and soup was a memory told like a fairy tale. The police still patrolled, though the Reich was dead. They carried notebooks instead of rifles now, recording who begged for bread, who whispered that Germany had lost. One morning, the sound of unfamiliar engines echoed from the south. Villagers ran to the square, expecting another requisition squad. Instead, a convoy of olive green trucks stopped by the church ruins. Men climbed down wearing helmets with white stars. They spoke a strange rhythm of English and laughter. The smell of diesel mixed with something miraculous, stew, thick and warm, bubbling in metal vats mounted on trailers. At first, no one dared approach. Frau Weber, whose husband had vanished on the Eastern Front, held her youngest behind her skirt. Memories of German police shouting, "Back, civilians!" haunted every step. The villagers waited for permission that never came. Then a tall sergeant, his name tag read Harris, knelt to eye level with a trembling boy and offered him a tin cup. Steam rose between them. "Ladies first," he said, gesturing to the mothers. The words meant little, but the tone meant everything. Laughter rippled through the crowd, uncertain at first, then free. Mothers came forward one by one. Harris filled bowls, sometimes slipping an extra piece of bread when he thought no one was watching. Children clutched their rations like treasure. An old man murmured, 12 years of speeches, and now 3 words, feed us. That evening, when the Americans packed up the kitchen, they left 2 barrels of soup behind with a note, for tomorrow. No signature, just handwriting round impatient. The next morning, the village awoke to find the police station empty. The officers had fled in the night, taking their records but leaving their pistols. No one pursued them. Letters from across occupied Germany told similar tales. In Thuringia, American field kitchens fed over 200,000 civilians daily by November 1945. Military cooks, many of them barely 20, became the first symbols of order that did not terrify. Housewives who once taught their children to salute now whispered English prayers before meals. It was not conversion, but gratitude. Later, historians would call it the kitchen diplomacy of 1945. But in those moments, it was simpler. Soup ladled from a stranger's hand tasted like forgiveness. The irony was painful. Defeat had brought dignity. And somewhere between the clang of ladles and the hush of snow, German mothers began to understand that kindness could carry a rifle too. That night, Harris wrote in his pocket diary, "We served 300 people today. The kids laughed when I said ladies first. I think they'll remember that sound longer than the bombs." The villagers did remember. Decades later, when Lomach built a memorial fountain, they engraved just 2 words on the base, ladies first. It stood not for victory or loss, but for the day fear melted before a bowl of soup. The ruins of Kassel still smoked when Private John Miller heard the faintest cry. He had been ordered to search for survivors in a bombed apartment block on Mittelgasse Street, a place where even the bricks seemed tired. The walls leaned inward like grieving shoulders, and every window was blind with soot. When the cry came again, thin as wind through glass, he followed it through a collapsed hallway and found her, an infant, swaddled in rags, lying beside an unconscious woman whose hands were cut from trying to dig her way out. He radioed for help, but the signal failed. For a moment, the young soldier stood frozen, the smell of smoke and milk souring the air. Then he took off his own jacket, the heavy wool still warm from his body, and wrapped the baby inside it. His jeep was parked 3 streets away, but every path was blocked with rubble. He carried the child against his chest and climbed over the wreckage, boots slipping on ash. Each heartbeat felt like a promise he didn't know how to keep. At the temporary clinic outside town, the medics worked on the woman for hours. Miller waited by the door, holding the baby wrapped in his coat. The child's breath was steady. In the lamplight, her tiny hand reached up and caught the edge of his dog-tag chain. He whispered, "You hold on, sweetheart," though she couldn't understand. Before leaving, he wrote a note on a scrap of field paper and pinned it to the collar. "Found by Pavret Miller. Keep her warm." 3 days later, the mother woke. Her first sight was the coat draped over her baby and the tag with the unfamiliar name. She cried not from pain, but from something she could not yet define, a sense that the enemy had protected what her own people had abandoned. When the story spread through Kassel, mothers repeated it in whispers like a prayer. The Americans kept our children warm when Germany turned cold. In the months that followed, U.S. relief records documented over 28,000 civilian rescues from collapsed buildings across occupied zones. Many involved women and children pulled from basements by men who weeks earlier had bombed those same streets. War twisted logic, but compassion untwisted it. Historians later found the note Miller wrote, preserved in a local museum. On the back, he had scribbled another line. "She stopped crying when I sang Blue Moon. I think maybe she thought it was a lullaby." It was. That single act of instinct, one man's choice to give warmth instead of judgment, traveled farther than any propaganda. When winter returned, German newspapers published human interest pieces about Allied soldiers saving infants, using words like miracle and grace. The phrase Miller's baby became shorthand in Kassel for unexpected kindness. Years later, the mother, Anna Weiss, would tell a journalist, "Every time I see a soldier, I look at his coat and wonder if it could hold a child." Her daughter grew up never fearing men in uniform, a rare inheritance in that generation. The image of that wool coat became a kind of folklore in post-war Germany, proof that salvation sometimes arrived draped in khaki, And though the baby would never remember the man who carried her through the ruins, the warmth he left behind lasted longer than any empire's glory. In the small Bavarian village of Ebersberg, the uniforms had changed, but the fear had not. Just weeks before, those same cobbled streets had echoed with the boots of German police squads hunting deserters and dissenters. Every window shutter knew the sound. 3 knocks, then silence, then a door forced open. Frau Lotte Engel still remembered the night they came for her husband, accused of listening to BBC radio. They never brought him back. From that day, she taught her son to lower his eyes whenever a man in uniform passed. When the first American patrol arrived, she was hanging laundry among the ruins of her garden wall. The soldiers stopped to ask for directions in clumsy German. Their sergeant pointed at a map, laughed when her boy tried to salute, and took off his helmet, revealing a head of blonde curls still matted with dust. Before leaving, he tipped his cap to an old woman carrying firewood, a gesture so ordinary, yet in that moment, extraordinary, because in 6 years, no man with power had ever bowed to weakness. Word spread that the new soldiers did not shout. They spoke softly, almost apologetically, even when inspecting houses. Some villagers thought it was a trick, but the pattern repeated: respectful tone, calm movements, the same nod to every grandmother who crossed the street. By the 3rd week, children no longer hid when jeeps passed. Lotte's diary from May 1945, later found in a family chest, contained a single line that captured an entire generation's disbelief. They carry guns like ours, but they do not make us small. In Munich, similar scenes unfolded. When American MPs entered the police headquarters on Etzstrasse, they ordered the remaining Nazi officers to remove their insignia and stand in silence before the civilians they had terrorized. One woman spat at the floor, another wept. The occupying soldiers simply watched, offering no speeches, no revenge. That quiet dismantling of authority did what no bomb could. It unlearned obedience. By June, surveys conducted by the U.S. Army's Information Control Division showed that 64% of German civilians in occupied areas described American troops as more trustworthy than local police. The number astonished both governments. The statistics, however, merely confirmed what mothers already felt. Trust could not be commanded. It had to be earned through the absence of fear. One afternoon, an American corporal asked to use Lotte's well. She hesitated but nodded. When he was done, he thanked her and offered cigarettes. She didn't smoke. She accepted anyway, unsure why her hands were trembling. Later she wrote, "Maybe this is how a wound begins to close, not by forgetting who hurt us, but by seeing someone who won't." The moment that transformed her came quietly. A convoy stopped at the village square. The American captain stepped out, noticed an elderly woman struggling with a bucket, and removed his cap to greet her. The entire crowd froze. It was the first time authority had bowed since anyone could remember. That single bow traveled faster than any broadcast, carried from kitchen to kitchen until even the skeptics began to believe that power could exist without cruelty. In that silence, heavier than sermons or speeches, the German mothers of Ebersberg discovered something new. That true order did not march. It listened. When the war ended, Germany filled with paper, permits, rations, censored postcards, all the paperwork of survival. Yet, among them, another kind of letter appeared, written not to relatives or officials, but to strangers wearing foreign uniforms. In dusty post offices and requisitioned schools, German mothers queued to hand over envelopes addressed to an unknown American soldier. Archivists would later find them stored in bundles, marked unclaimed, 1946 to 47. The ink had faded, but the emotion had not. One began simply, "My son lived because you did not shoot." Another, written in uncertain English, said, "You gave me bread when our own police gave me fear." These were not political statements. They were confessions of gratitude that no one had asked for. In Kassel, the same city where Private Miller had once found the infant, a translator named Ruth Newman volunteered to help the Americans sort civilian mail. She would end each day reading a few of these letters aloud. Some were anonymous, others signed only with first names: Anna, Gertrude, Elise. They described little miracles: soldiers repairing roofs, delivering milk, or sitting quietly while mothers cried. One woman wrote, "I never thought kindness could wear boots." Ruth kept a small notebook of phrases that struck her. She later admitted, Those letters taught me more about peace than any surrender document. Her notebook survives today in the National Archives, its pages trembling with the human handwriting of redemption. The letters also reveal a deeper contrast. For 12 years, German citizens had written only upward, to party officials, police, or authorities who demanded praise. Now they wrote sideways, to equals, to human beings. It was as if the entire moral direction of communication had shifted. Statistically, the phenomenon was immense. Between 1945 and 1948, the U.S. Occupation Administration logged over 120,000 unsolicited thank you letters from civilians. About 1/3 came from mothers referencing acts of mercy toward children. It was an unseen diplomacy, built not on treaties, but on hand-drawn hearts at the bottom of pages. One of the most touching stories emerged from Würzburg. A widow named Hilda Brenner mailed a letter wrapped around a photograph of her teenage son. The boy had been caught stealing bread by an American patrol. The officer, instead of arresting him, ordered him to clean the Jeep tires and then gave him 2 loaves. Hilda wrote, "He brought home bread and a new face. He said the soldier called him kid, not thief. I did not know a word could feed us." In another bundle, a mother confessed that she had hidden 2 escaped French prisoners during the war. "I thought I was doing a crime," she wrote. "Now the Americans tell me it was right." The letter ends with one sentence. "You gave me permission to be decent again." These letters were never printed in newspapers. The occupying authorities considered them too sentimental, fearing accusations of propaganda. But their existence, rediscovered decades later, became evidence of something historians could not quantify: moral astonishment. What do you think, watching this now? If your family had lived through that collapse, would you have written such a letter to a foreign soldier, a stranger who saved your child? Would you have had the courage to say thank you when the world told you to hate? The answers live not in archives, but in the quiet of every home that survived that winter, where a mother once lit a candle, not for victory, but for the man who had given her back her voice. It was January 1946, one of the coldest winters in memory. Across Bavaria, coal was rationed, potatoes frozen solid in cellars, and even hope seemed to have frostbite. In Augsburg, 3 children huddled around a stove built from a dismantled mailbox. Their mother, Clara Vogel, had hidden half a loaf of bread behind a loose brick in the wall. She had learned to hide things, first from air raids, then from men with notebooks. That morning, 2 German policemen arrived at her door. They were wearing new uniforms with old faces. The new government called them reintegrated civil order. But everyone knew what that meant. The same men, only fewer medals. They announced an inspection for illegal food storage. Clara froze, heart pounding. Her youngest whispered, "Mama, don't let them take our bread." While they searched her kitchen, laughter drifted in from outside. American soldiers were unloading supplies next door. Clara watched through the window. They were stacking bread loaves and chocolate bars on a wooden table, calling children over with exaggerated German. "Come, come!" A sergeant handed out slices, joking that he'd open a bakery if the war didn't end soon. Inside, the older policeman found the hidden half-loaf. He held it up like evidence. "Ration fraud," he muttered, though the ink on his armband was barely dry from being repainted. Clara pleaded, "It's for the children." He didn't meet her eyes. The younger one hesitated, then turned away. "Just write her name," he said softly. At that moment, an American corporal appeared at the door, carrying a tray of bread for the neighbors. He froze, sensing the tension, then offered 1 loaf to each child without a word. The policeman stepped back. For a second, 2 uniforms faced each other, one representing law, the other compassion. One demanded control, the other offered relief. Later, the story spread through the neighborhood. The Americans gave bread while the Germans confiscated it. The symbolism was brutal in its simplicity. By spring, U.S. military statistics recorded distributing 13,000 tons of flour in Bavaria alone, enough to feed every child twice over. Meanwhile, domestic police reports showed more than 2,000 ration violations prosecuted that same season, nearly all against women. People began calling it das doppelte Deutschland, the double Germany, one ruled by memory, the other by mercy. The mothers noticed first. They stopped reporting to the police when food went missing and started knocking on the American depot gates instead. When questioned years later, one of the policemen admitted, "We wanted to serve, but the Americans had already shown them what service looked like." His words captured the quiet revolution that no army had planned, the redefinition of authority itself. Clara kept the loaf that day. She sliced it into 4 pieces, placed them carefully on the chipped table, and whispered to her children, "Remember who fed you and who frightened you." That phrase became family legend. Now, imagine standing in that kitchen. Imagine watching 2 men in uniform, one taking, one giving, and realizing that the future of your children's trust would depend on which image stayed in their minds. Which one would stay in yours? Leave your thoughts below. Would you have opened the door to the old police or to the strangers offering bread? Outside, the snow kept falling, but for the first time since the war began, it covered both boots, the old and the new, in equal silence. The last spring of the occupation came softly, as if the land itself was learning to breathe again. In a small village near Nuremberg, a 6-year-old girl named Elsa stood by the window of a house without glass, waiting for her mother to finish sewing. The cloth was blue, faded but still bright enough to catch the light. It was the dress her mother had promised she would wear on the day peace comes. Kept for years, the fabric had stayed folded in a drawer, untouched through bombings, hunger, and despair. When the American convoy rolled into the valley, Elsa pointed and shouted, "Mama, today! Today is the blue dress day!" Her mother smiled, half believing, half afraid. She dressed her daughter in the tiny garment that barely fit, its hem uneven, its thread trembling. Outside, soldiers were setting up power lines along the main road. One climbed a pole and fixed a wire, another switched on a generator. A faint hum filled the air, followed by the flicker of electric light, small, wavering, but real. For the first time since 1943, their house glowed. Neighbors gathered, children squealing as the bulbs warmed. Elsa's mother whispered, "They brought back the light," and meant it in more ways than one. The moment spread like a heartbeat through the village, lanterns replaced by lamps, whispers replaced by laughter. The same troops who once marched through foreign streets now carried ladders, nails, and coils of copper wire. Among them was Sergeant Tom Harris, the same man who had ladled soup in Saxony months before. He recognized faces that no longer looked frightened. A woman offered him a handful of wildflowers as thanks. He tucked one behind his helmet strap, embarrassed. Later that evening, when the power reached the schoolhouse, he saw Elsa spinning in the blue dress beneath the hanging light bulb. He laughed and said to his comrade, "That's what victory should look like." The numbers told a quieter story. By mid-1947, American engineering units had restored electricity to more than 6,000 German towns and installed over 40,000 new streetlights. Each one was a small resurrection, but it was children like Elsa who turned it into meaning. Her mother, Greta, later wrote a letter, one of thousands the Americans would never see. "When the police came, I hid my child. When the soldiers came, she danced. That is all you need to know about who we trusted." Years passed. The blue dress, carefully folded, survived even when new uniforms and flags appeared. When Elsa grew old, she placed it in a small wooden box with a note. This was worn on the day the lights returned. It rests now in a local museum, faded to a shade between sky and memory. Visitors still pause before it. Some see fabric, others see forgiveness stitched by necessity. The threads are uneven, but they hold. That night in 1947, as lamps glowed over cobblestones, Greta looked through the window and saw her daughter twirling, the blue skirt flaring like a piece of morning sky caught between dusk and hope. She whispered, "Let her remember this light, not the sirens." And in that whisper, trust was reborn. Not in governments, not in armies, but in simple acts of decency that made strangers human again. History rarely changes with thunder. More often, it changes with gestures too small to measure: an open hand, a shared meal, a borrowed coat. Between 1945 and 1950, Germany learned this truth through the quiet revolution of its mothers. They had lived under a regime that promised protection, yet ruled through fear. Then came the occupiers, men who did not speak their language but somehow spoke to their hunger, their exhaustion, their longing to be treated gently again. Those years redrew moral boundaries more than political ones. Mothers who had once saluted posters now hid their tears when American soldiers fixed a roof or handed them milk powder. They began to rebuild not only homes, but a sense of what authority could mean. Every bowl of soup in a ruined square, every soldier who carried a child through rubble, every note left on a rescued baby's blanket. Each became a small act of disobedience against the cruelty that had defined their world. Sociologists later called it the trust inversion. In 1945, surveys showed that fewer than 1 in 5 Germans trusted any uniform. By 1948, more trusted American soldiers than their own police. That statistic was more than data, it was testimony. It told of women like Marta, who learned peace from footsteps that didn't kick doors. Of Harris, whose ladle became a symbol stronger than a rifle. Of Miller, whose coat warmed an infant and an entire city's conscience. Of Greta and Elsa, who wore blue to welcome the light. The world often imagines that nations heal through treaties or trials, but sometimes healing begins when a mother dares to believe that not every man with power will harm her child. The story of why German mothers trusted American troops more than their own police is not just about war. It is about the long road from obedience to dignity, from silence to speech. Even decades later, survivors described a strange nostalgia, not for defeat, but for the first time they saw kindness wearing a gun belt. They remembered the taste of soup more vividly than the speeches of generals. That memory, fragile yet indestructible, became the first brick of the new Germany. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of those years. The compassion once given outlasts the orders of any regime. In the end, the sound that replaced the sirens was not triumph or revenge. It was the steady hum of a generator, the murmur of a soldier saying, "Ladies first," the laughter of a child in a blue dress beneath a single electric bulb. History began again that night, not with surrender, but with trust, rebuilt one loaf of bread, one letter, one act of mercy at a time.